So welcome everybody. I'm Zoe and I'm a data scientist in Nottinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust, which is in the other category that we had earlier. So it's both mental health and general health. So it just kind of, it doesn't fit. It's like a bit of everything, but I work in public health data or with data a bit as well. So to encourage people to do what I'm going to do today, which is I found something that I thought was really interesting and I wanted to share it. And I needed a place to sort of like consolidate all my thoughts into one place. And that's what I'm doing with you today. So I'm hoping it will work out in this next 3/4 of an hour or so. I'm a person who likes interaction. I know that as an analyst or data scientist or statistician even, we don't always get an opportunity to launch in and say things, sometimes for fear of not doing it. It takes practice, but I'd also like people to feel that you can interrupt me. I really don't mind. So as we go along, if I don't make sense about something, please say something, or if you have a thought about something, please do interact. I said in the kind of like the abstract bit that we shared that my background is, well, my degree was philosophy, so I talk a lot about things, but I love data as well. So ethics in that kind of context, what has it got to do with data analysis? Many people, I haven't asked the question, but it would be interesting to know if you wanted to put something in the chat or speak up. Do you even have that need to consider ethics in your day-to-day work? Is it something that you think is of interest? As a philosopher, I'm not a philosopher, but I philosophize, tend to ask lots of questions about things to try and spur debate even with myself. And it does feel like I've been an analyst for nearly 10 years, maybe more. I've lost track of time, but certainly a decade felt like it anyway. Ethics has never been something that's ever been considered. It's just something that happens outside of my work. It's just not something that's come up. So ethics in my head, even when I was thinking about it, it's like, oh, it's for research. I mean, it's very, very strict with research. If colleagues here are doing anything, it's very precise. There's a formula for it. You can't go against their ethical decisions often, I have found out. Or artificial intelligence, like cutting edge data science, analytics, it's for that kind of thing, which I don't get involved with. It's never been part of my work. I've had ethical concerns about things and wrangled with things, but it's not been something I've actually had to report to anybody about. And ethics committees, I've been part of an ethics committee here in my trust, and even then it feels like it should really be for medical cases. It's got nothing to do with data, and there are procedures that we work with and we work under, and surely that covers it, doesn't it? And I think this is probably a good point to say you can be ethical and illegal, and you can be legal and unethical. And I kind of feel that that's really important for even these ethics committees that we go to. We can follow procedures, we can do everything apparently correctly, but given time, looking at history, sometimes we go, well, that was unethical. Why did they do that? But it was ethical at that time. And the big thing that gets me really is there any consequence to being unethical as well? So it feels like there's a massive like tiger. You need to be ethical, and you go to the ethics committee and it can feel frightening. But what happens if it's not ethical? Sometimes it feels like very little. The other point about ethics is that I'm a good person. I know what I'm doing is okay. That's it. That's all I need to consider. Like a nice picture. But it can be difficult. That you can be a good person and find it very difficult to feel certain in what you're doing. Medics do this, and they recognize this in terms of their ethics committees. We make these decisions, but we don't always feel comfortable with them. So I wanted to pose a question that I think maybe quite a lot of people here will have encountered or heard of, I hope, but you'll learn a bit more as we go through it. And this is just a general question, really. So there's a freedom of information request. This is something that comes in to data quite frequently. You can do freedom of information requests of anything to do with public information. And a question last year was asked, this is a hypothetical situation, about waiting times. A figure was given. A question very similar this year, and somebody found that there was an error in the code. So the number was very different. Now the question is, do we use the old code because it follows what we did last year? Or do we use the new code? And it'd be really interesting at this point to try and spur some debate, either in the chat if people feel that that's a place to do that, or speak up. Do you have a gut instinct about this? Is it like absolutely clear as day which one it should be? Or do you kind of get to that, I don't know. Tom's being polite. He's put his hand up. Go on, Tom.
Did you want me to just shout up?
Just shout. That's fine. I don't mind.
I mean, this has not been a hypothetical situation for me. It's been an actual situation. And I'm not going to say who the previous analyst was who wrote the query, because that'd be really rude to out myself with an but I mean, I think
it happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think I took option C, which was do both and then give it up the chain for someone more senior to wrangle about. But yeah, I have to give the caveat of this is the issue that was found before. This is the reasons that we found.
But that's perfect, because outside of that, in ethical terms, I was just going A or B. I never considered that as an option, like do both. And then the option is also to bring in other views. In the chat, it says use the new code and explain in the response why it differs. Now, I considered that too, but just to pose that, the person may not be the same person as before. So that could be quite confusing to a member of the public, because they don't have to say who they are. Well, I mean, they can. You can say that you've got different, you can do it anonymously, but you may not be the person who asked last time. So that may cause consternation, confusion to the new person who may just be asking, because waiting times, they're quite fixed, which is why I use that scenario. Does anybody else have any views? You don't have to say if this has ever happened to you, but if this happened, which it could very easily do, looking back at your old code. I've done this so many times when I've gone, why did I use that join? And why did I use that? I'm going to go quiet, try and see if anyone will speak up. Embarrassment is also mentioned in the chat, and I think that is a good point, particularly if it's your own code. And I've had this in my normal analysis where I've gone over and I'm like, why did I do that? What we do is quite complex and quite under pressure, time pressures. So we're human and we learn as well. So my code from last year is not as good as this year. I look back at it and go, oh, that's embarrassing. And if you get a different number, justifying it can be very tricky. Any more points? You can put those into the chat if you can type fast enough. A or B? Let's put A or B in.
Mm-hmm. I think it can. Can you hear me? I think it's
yes, I can. Sorry, no, it's my fault.
No, that's okay. I think it's quite hard to admit to these things, isn't it? And also, quite often, the work that we do moves on quickly.
Yes.
And we don't necessarily look at it maybe in enough sort of detail, really, or we don't really build in enough time to reflect very in the detail that we need to see whether we're actually asking the right questions about what we're doing. So no, I think it's fascinating, and I'm sure if we've all thought, I'm not sure about that, but you think, oh well, I think it's okay. I've done this, but maybe on reflection there was a better way of doing it,
or you might be rushed and then go back just a couple of weeks later and think, actually that would have been better. I didn't consider that, because these things look simple sometimes but quite complex. Yeah, Katie, you've got your hand up.
It's just, I mean, I will input just because I've got my hand up, because I think transparency is really important. So personally, I would definitely say that I've found a better way of doing something, and perhaps this is the updated figure based on last time's solution, but actually the better solution would be, and then would give last time's and this time's as a comparator. I just wanted to say, some of us can't see the chat, that we don't have a chat function, so it would be really useful. Yes. I don't know why, but we can't see it.
It's workspace. Yeah, if you're on the workspace, you can see it. But I will read out people's points as they come up, so that you don't miss. Yeah,
up to date with what's in there, because we can't add to it. We don't have the function.
So the other bit that I didn't mention was in the chat. Somebody said to alert someone else to agree with that. So bringing in other people. But interestingly, I'm finding this quite interesting, because hierarchy is a thing for me. We always go up the chain. And sometimes I feel that we get more support, or equal support, let's say, with peers across. So the ethics committees, for example, they're made up of groups of people, and there could be all sorts of individuals there, some public facing people too, or public representatives as it is, like volunteers or patients. And they have views which are just as valid. So that's more of a procedural view in my mind. But ethical, I might say A, but my colleague might go, oh, I'd B. So again, that has another interesting dimension to it, which is what I'm trying to kind of entice people to think, that ethics is actually, quite big, but is there a right answer as well? And no, not really. Ethics isn't really right or wrong. I think that's why it can be a bit scary in philosophy, because you need structured, constructive arguments and critiques, but it's not necessary unless you're doing logic, where that's very mathematical in its thinking. But there is no right or wrong answer, because there are views to this, and the more views we have, the better. So one of the things, just as an example from ethics committees, the one that I attend, which is in my acute hospital, they want 20 people there. But decision-making meetings, you're better off with about 7 people. Ethics is not necessarily about a decision. It's about supporting the decision or debriefing a decision that's made as well. So in terms of medical ethics, if you've made a decision, but did I make the right decision? Did I do the right thing? You're doing like you would do if you were talking to family or friends and say, does this sound like I did, my intention was good, but did it come across well? Can I learn from this? And that's what an ethics committee in some places is also serving that purpose. So we can only find out the answer was wrong perhaps after the event. And do we even know that we've caused damage? Because we give freedom of information data quite freely. Well, we have to, but we don't always know what happens with it. It could just be, oh, that's interesting, nothing happens, or it could end up in a journalistic review. We just don't know. So this is where data hazards came into it, and I was introduced to it through the Bristol data ethics team, a couple of data scientists who were working on their PhDs. They run that, and I'll talk a bit more about their ethics group, but they also developed this in the background, which felt like an amazing piece of work that they've opened up for everybody to use and contribute to, which is based on the COSH pictograms. And COSH, I don't know what that stands for, but it's hazards for chemical hazards. So it's a quick visual, but lots of information to say this is a hazard and this is what you need to look out for. They alert us to a terrible, look at that, you can't see the rest of the sentence there, so I needed to move that down. Sorry. They alert us to the potential precautions that we need to take. They're not saying do not use, there's no crosses on them. That's a different warning sign, but they're giving you warnings to take precautions. They're saying we've thought about this, particularly in chemicals, it could do that. It could be corrosive, which is one, toxic. They don't go away, but they'll have a symbol on it, which is quite a common thing with a skeleton. So what they did was took it for data, and that would be really handy, wouldn't it? So we have a piece of work. Oh, sorry, a couple of questions or comments as I was just getting ahead of myself to raise that this may be a training support issue for the people involved in the original code, ethical to support learning. Yes, that's another dimension to it. So that's going to come a little bit later, I think, in some of the hazards and the way we think about this in terms of precautions. What can we do? And I think that would fit in there, helping colleagues, maybe doing some validation, that kind of thing. Is it worth defining ethics, or at least how you're using it in the word? That's excellent, because I've seen this before and I had to look it up. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not particularly precise on my language between ethics and morality, but they are distinct groups. So I think for me, this is just me, I need to really work this through, but the ethics is the application of your thinking. So morality, I did write a dissertation on this, so I should know more, but morality can sometimes come from distinct regulations and rules. You may have a morality code, let's say from a religious belief, but ethics is slightly different. Tell you what, I will go away, look upon it and reflect. I did look, but it was something that I didn't really, but ethics is slightly different to morality. I feel like I can be a moral person, but I can still make unethical decisions. I can use plastic, for example, but still think deeply and concerned about the environment. But my ethics are kind of stretched there, but I'm trying to be more of a moral person. But there's a different discussion, and I feel like I should have paid attention in my essays, but they were a long time ago. So it's definitely many years ago. Excellent question. Put me on the spot. I love it. Data ethics. I'll put in a slide at some point about what ethics means. And I want to introduce the data hazards, which they're not actually talking about ethics in this regard, but they're saying hazards. But I think it was good to go through the ethical bit to see why we could label these things, or at least try to label them. Their view was to have a way, a little bit like the COSH, to have a starting point to say, this is what we've linked on. This is what we think needs to be considered. It's open source as a tool. It's open contribution as well. So if you can think of another hazard or want to add to it about, defining what do you mean by these words, which in a sense is really key in philosophy, that's really useful too. And I think this is useful for inviting other views on a project, because you can work really, really hard like you can on your own code. And then somebody else comes in and just has a completely new view to these things and sets things off. And that's happened today, actually, with just a few views that have come through. I'm starting to think, oh yeah, that's another avenue to consider. That is the purpose of having as many people involved in your discussions as possible, not necessarily the hierarchical thing. That's why I was a bit like, well, even going outside of your trust, say, to other analysts. I say trust, there's a lot of local authority people here, and the NHS too should go to our local authority colleagues, people in our areas, and say, what do you think about this? How do you deal with your freedom of information, for example? When to use them? Well, they were using it in a research context because they're researchers in data science, and I could see the value of it in day-to-day work. So I've kind of stretched their original use, but they were saying, thinking about worst case scenarios. And we rarely get the chance to stop and think about that when nothing's gone wrong. So you do your return, somebody asks you waiting list numbers or whatever, you just give the information and that's it, done. But stopping to think, right, okay, if I label this piece of work, now that could be intensive, and you may say, well, that's not necessary. Really, we're asked to do something, we do that. But maybe if we did think about the worst case scenario, it would be quite interesting to take that further. And I will say, I found it quite interesting going through the next scenario to show each of the hazards. I thought about things in that regard that I'd never really considered before. You may use all or none of the hazards. I mean, there's one that is a general hazard, which is used for pretty much every single scenario in terms of data. So there will probably be a hazard for each, but different degrees of hazards. And you could use all of them. And it's not just for your project and what you do. Freedom of information is quite interesting because it's what people will do next. So you could be involved with, say, a service audit that gets published. What do people do with that published information? Where do they take it? What could happen? What harms could be caused? I'll just check the chat. Oh, okay. Got the chat. Excellent. Somebody can see that now. Scenario 1, revisiting. So what I started to do with this was explain general hazards. And then I thought, well, not general hazards, data hazards. I thought I'll go back to that freedom of information one where I had A or B, and I'll go through and I'll label them. So I'll do that with you to show all the different labels and explain them as I go along, my thinking. And it'd be really good if you chip in and say, what about this? Or I don't agree with that. That's a ridiculous notion. I'd really like that. So general hazard. Oh, go on, Rachel, hand up.
Yeah, just to say that I have actually on Menti, for those who can't use the chat still, they can put questions in there. So if they don't want to shout out.
Menti, brilliant.
Yeah, so they're just a general thing. You can put some things on there, and I did put those other couple of questions on that you were interested in asking our wonderful audience. So they're there for you when you want them. Okay.
So I've put in the slides, which are through our team's GitHub as well, so I can share that link with you later as well through the chats and things. But each one has a link, so each label has just a few scenarios that they've come up with. And again, the point being that a couple of people have tried to think really hard about this, but you can add other things to it. And of course, they're very research based, and I'm data analysis, data scientist based, and my things were not research orientated. So general hazard, they've listed here with all the descriptions, examples, and safety precautions, which comes to the point that was in the chat about maybe doing learning for certain things or supporting staff. So general hazards, if I go back to it, sorry, it's pretty much always in there. It says it applies to all data science research outputs. And I think any of our work probably has a data hazard, but thinking about what that is exactly is important. So for freedom of information, particularly this one, I thought, well, there could be misunderstanding, there could be misinterpretation by the person receiving it, also by us, because it may be that the mistake last year was a misunderstanding of the question, because we can't go back to general public people and say, by waiting list, did you mean somebody who's been referred and been accepted, or did you mean everybody who's referred? Can we clarify? Because you don't get that interaction with a freedom of information request necessarily. There may be errors, changes in methodology, which I think was mentioned earlier. I think that was Rachel, you said, you may change things, you may learn things. We may get a better system. So last year we had this system, or analysts didn't know SQL, and this year they do. And because they're using SQL, things were just a bit easier to test. Oh, somebody in their last job frequently went back with freedom of information. So did you give feedback and go, well, actually, we've updated it? That's brilliant, actually. I didn't know you could do that. And we don't know what happens to the request. I've mentioned that before. So you may get a request and that's it. I've done freedom of information myself and I've done nothing with the data. I've just gone, oh, that's really interesting. Or I did it to get information that I could do nothing with in the end. But again, it might end up in the BBC because anybody can put in a request. Oh, you would clarify the question. Ah, that's excellent. I've never done that myself, clarify the question. So I didn't realize that was possible. It's also been said that it gives you a bit more time to respond as well, which is very true. Now, the precautions we could take in this scenario is that we could mitigate it with a caveat as we give it, that the data is subject to change, that there may be some issues with it, methodology could change. So we give a caveat. Public health do this quite a bit, I think, in the data that is given. It's a lot sturdier in the process, I would say, than freedom of information. Over years, you make sure that things are checked, but there's still caveats, I guess. We could issue corrections publicly. So I know my trust always puts them on the website. We could then add to that and say, unfortunately, we found that this was different and this is a change. So if anybody goes back to old data, they can see the change rather than necessarily going back to the individual or company that asked. We can share methodology. Now, I was starting to put this frequently in there because somebody said about transparency, and I agree with that. I'm very much about open methodology and coding, and in the NHS specifically, and I'm opening that also to local authority colleagues, we probably don't publish our SQL code in the amount that I think we should, because it's just code. So there's a lot of resistance to it, although there's also a lot of people who are sort of pushing for that as well. So if it's out there and somebody looked at it and went, oh, I've tried your methodology and your code in my data and it doesn't work, I think you've got something wrong there, that helps us self-audit. But we don't have that principle at the moment. So I would say that would be a really good precaution. If anybody has any different views on that, please do jump in and say, no, we shouldn't share our SQL code because give your reason, ... That would be interesting. Again, chat, Menti, interrupt, please. Otherwise, I'll just talk and talk. Now, reinforcing existing biases, people probably have heard about this in various things about having biases. We're thinking about it a bit more. Things may change in the current political climate about how valid these biases are. But I think in data, we have to consider this. It's very hard in this scenario, I think, to suggest that there was a mistake made. So maybe if we went for option A to repeat that, could we be reusing it to reinforce a bias? I think the thing is we don't know what the data was used for. So if it's a service that was particularly for, or I say particularly, there are some services in mental health that are predominantly used by certain genders or mainly genders, I'd say. Does that reinforce a bias? So if one service is female orientated and their waiting list is really long compared to a different condition which is affecting more males, is there a bias there that we are contributing to, but we didn't necessarily know? So you're kind of thinking about steps well ahead, well away from you, which I suppose makes it feel like the question could be, is that valid? Is that a valid thing to do? Constantly wondering about what people will do with your data, outputs, your aggregate figures. Precautions. Although the freedom of information is related to one service, maybe we, in this regard, should look at the other services and say, we've got this waiting list here for this one, but what about these other ones? We have one service in my trust, it has very, very long waiting lists because it is a national service. They were asked so many freedom of information requests that they now publish it on their website. So our response to those questions are, it's on the website. So that fixes it, really. That doesn't make it ad hoc. So each time somebody new looks at it, it's actually one source. So that is a service that is affected by a particular group of people as well. So there could be bias involved in it, and that could mitigate it by being open and transparent, which is what somebody raised earlier. I'm going to say again, you can jump in and say, no, I don't agree with that, or that's really hard to do, or you haven't thought about this. Or am I just really that good in my thinking on this? Because I did enjoy going through this.
No, you're brilliant, obviously. No,
Obviously.
I'm just reflecting, so I haven't responded to a freedom of information request for a bit. I don't mean I've ignored them. I just haven't had one. I haven't been in a role where I've been asked to respond to one, but I have had in the past lots. So when I worked at a county council in Staffordshire, namely Staffordshire County Council, we did have a lot of freedom, and they still will have a lot of freedom of information requests. And in terms of the response to them, some of it really is around, obviously there are conditions that you have to respond within a certain time, etc., etc.
Yeah.
As Jackie points out, if you do go back to the originator and seek to clarify the question so that you are necessarily spending a load of time on something which is actually the right question, as opposed to, like you would in normal work, as opposed to something which was ambiguous, and so that you're doing the right thing. There's some of it in terms of how far you go with your responses, just how much time you've got.
Yes,
because quite often it's so I mean, which is a shame, but it's you do what you have to do sort of legally, and you do be as helpful as you can to the person who's clearly wanting that information.
Yeah, because you don't always know the intention, do you?
You don't.
I've done it to be like, I'm going to get this information from you and I'm going to create work for you. I know, but
yeah.
Other people might genuinely need to know, as in.
Yeah, you don't necessarily know. Sometimes I think depending on the request, because they vary so much, you have a lot more information about what they're going to be using it for. But quite often it's just a vacuum, and you don't necessarily know what it's going to be used for, how it's going to be used. But yes, so someone's just made a point on comments. So I shall, while I'm going on a bit, I shall address that one. So. Oh, so someone has said, has anyone else felt that the number of incoming freedom of information requests has sharply risen over the last 6 to 12 months? So that might be an
excellent question, because again, it comes to that intention, doesn't it? I know it creates work. So in a sense, to my parish council about the water usage at allotment, I might have been slightly peevish about it, because I wanted them to respond and they didn't know how to do it. So they fell out of that timescale. So, I let the ICO know. So I was genuinely being a bit peevish there. And people do this. So they can sometimes do it in anger. But then we can't apply anything to it. You can't, a bit like, coming in through the doors of acute hospitals. They don't go, why are you here? It's like, you're to be treated for this. There's no categorization of individuals. It's about conditions and diagnoses, isn't it? So yes, they do go up, they fluctuate up, and maybe the question back to us generally about this is this worthwhile for this subject? Because there's very little that we can do. We've got restricted timescales. Should we be doing this? Is this necessary? I mean, I was using it as a nice example. And actually, some of this kind of applied to all freedom of information. It's like they all have this concern, like, what do people do with the data? Pretty sure we have this information, this nagging feeling, like, what are people doing with this? Because it's not like an agile thing where you get a user story and then you can work with it and make sure you've done it correctly. You're just like, oh, you just asked for waiting list. Well, here you go. There's a number. I'll carry on because there's a few more. But if people want to say in the chat or shout out that, like, their work is inundated and it's perhaps all COVID related or not COVID related, that would be interesting to know. Ranks or classifies people. So on this one, I was thinking, one of the scenarios that could be is that we don't rank it. We just go, this is our service and this is what we've done. But then the requester may have actually asked all of the trusts the same question, and then they rank it. And they could be the BBC, or they could be a national newspaper. And then suddenly we're in the news because they've ranked us, because it's possible to do. Worst case scenario. And the precautions is publish the methodology and or the code. I was like, I'm going to write this. So if I do a count in a certain way, I say my waiting list is when somebody's been referred and they've been accepted. And then another trust analyst, or maybe even local authority, if it's also hitting the local authorities, looks at it and goes, our waiting list for us are just you're referred in and then that's it, you're on a waiting list. We don't do that. Then we can actually share that knowledge. High environmental costs. Now, if we're thinking about research and other areas, and it can be ours too, when we're talking about this kind of hazard, it's like storage units, servers, data. And so I tried to be clever about this and thinking, I've done this. My code has been resource hungry because I've done subqueries or correlators, like it's looped itself and it's not very good. That's when that learning comes in, where somebody better than me goes, don't do that. So could I be creating something that's resource hungry? This is a one-off, but if I were to do it repeatedly, it could be a large data set. And that made me start thinking about the HES data, which is hospital episode something. I don't work in an acute trust. But actually that data is shared across many acute trusts, like acute trusts get all of it. So they're all storing that data. So are we contributing to, the environment negatively by storing the same data? I'm going to come to the questions in a minute, but I'll do the precautions and then I'll check the chat. So the precautions for this could be code reviews, validation, learning opportunities, which was pretty much brought up because of the error, but maybe we should be doing that anyway in terms of environment. Unnecessarily resource hungry code scripts like mine. So when answering an FOI, it said here, I always assume the requester is a national newspaper and think that it would be on the front page news. That's an excellent view to take. What would be the worst case scenario in the news? And from an ethical point of view, isn't the whole premise of FOI that it should be ethical? We should have access to information freely. Now, for me, I will just answer that. I wonder why people have to ask. Now, I've had this situation where I've said, well, that is an FOI to somebody. We've had a discussion and, I've asked for code and they said, no, you can't have the code. And I was like, well, I want the code. Why can't I see the code? I can FOI that. And then I think you'll have to give it to me. And then, that's not the way we should be working. But we could do an FOI. So for my view, it's like waiting times. If you're going to give that freely, why don't you publish it on your website like our service has taken that particular service was like, we get this so often, let's just publish it. Rachel, you've been patient while I ranted.
No, it's fine. So it's just follows on from Jackie's point about considering the audience always to be a national newspaper. So somebody says on the Menti that they've seen their FOI responses as local newspaper headlines several times, and they always buy a copy for their mum. Lol.
Oh, no, that's a lovely
lol,
view.
That was me.
That's a lovely view. I would be like, oh, what have they interpreted from this? Oh, Paul, was that you?
Sorry, I was just going to correct you on the HES data. It's not replicated across all trusts.
Oh, great.
In fact, we don't even have access to HES data. We only have access to HES data through HED. What happens is we send our data to SUS. SUS sends it through HES. HES does the hospital episode statistics, and that is just stored nationally. So it's not replicated everywhere.
Yeah, because I don't work with acute data and I just know that people have access to it. So in my head, it was like, well, it's being released by NHS Digital. It felt like it was like, here's data for you and here's data for you. And because I didn't know the layout, I know in terms of Open Safely, if people have heard of that uses HES data, but they send queries to the data set, bring it back in aggregate form for researchers. So trusted research environments, which is an excellent way of keeping the data in one place, securely set, and then auditing who uses it and what they're writing to it. Goldacre review, if anybody's interested in that. So that's really good to know. So that would not be a precaution in this case, and certainly not for my mental health trust data, because we don't use the HES. So lacks community involvement. I think this harks to some of the things that we were talking about. It kind of crept up, I felt. What I was thinking with this is that the issues are generally that the requests are not checked with the community. I think it was your point, Rachel, we don't have the time necessarily to do anything with it. So we're getting these requests sometimes from the community, but we don't do anything more than just answer them and then move on. So in a precaution, but also to give an example, I had a freedom of information request, which was what smoking cessation services do we offer under 16s? And out of that, I couldn't answer any of it because we didn't have the data. But to me, it was like, oh, that's a really interesting point. There are under 16s who smoke. It's mental health services, so we do have other things that go on. The assumption is always that an under 16-year-old, because it is illegal to smoke, is not non-smoker, but there are some children that start smoking at a young age. And should we be considering smoking cessation services when we look at smoking cessation services generally? Should we be looking at how to help younger children who actually shouldn't have access to it, but somehow they do? So for me, that was a bit like the community interaction. I had a request, don't know why, who, what was it, but it got me thinking, well, we don't have this data, not in a reproducible fashion that I can go in other than looking at text data. But nothing went with it, though, because we didn't have a process of going, actually, that's a really interesting question. Can we take this further? Because I'll be really blunt here. Our interesting questions are requested of us from our national bodies. They say, we want this, and we go, here you go. We don't go, well, yeah, that's great, but actually what we think is interesting is this. So we can give you that data, but we think we should be looking at this too. And that's where our profession comes into it. We should be saying things like smoking cessation services for under 16s. Where is it needed? Again, soapbox, please, just go, no, yes, right on, don't agree. What you're talking about, please interrupt.
I suppose you could just so on that particular example, you could refer that information to the public health, local authority and public health. So just to make them aware that this was something that was of interest, and just it could be something that just making connections. So instead of everything having feeling like you have to respond to everything, we are a big system, as we work together with all these other organisations and systems, there's somebody else who's probably much better placed to either answer the question or respond to the originator.
That is an excellent point, because it's very easy for me to always forget that we're part of a bigger unit, bigger group of people. So if I say, and I have talked about smoking generally with public health people, and I got such a different insight to it. And I guess, although I'm coming at this from ethics and data hazards, and isn't this great, but really it's about communicating with as many people as possible and getting different views. So it's a good point, because there may be something that they have more information on, or public data is pretty lacking because it's not reported in ONS, Office of National Statistics, below 16, because it shouldn't happen. It's illegal. Is it under 18, actually? I think is it under, anybody here from public health? Things changed. I did this data analysis, but my data stuck like 20, 30 years in my head. I think it was, when I was growing up, it was 16, but it might be 18 now. I think it's changed. I think my knowledge is out of date. I'm like one of those old people who are like, oh, in my day it was this. Danger of misuse. Well, yes, I think freedom of information generally has this, because we don't know what's going with it. So we could give a number, and the public health COVID dashboard was brilliant in its dashboard data. It was simple, but people could still interpret the data completely differently. You can have the very same, I've actually seen the same charts for things and the same data and completely different takes on it. So I think, there was a spike in 2020. People might have heard of COVID and pandemic, but that very same chart, somebody said quite, I think they might have been in academia, said, something's happened here, we need to investigate, on Twitter. And it was like, it's the same data. And lots of people have been talking about a pandemic, but you're saying it's something else. Now that's the same data. But we looked at it differently. So that must happen with freedom of information, because we don't know what happens. We don't have an interaction after we've given that information, or years later, because that information should still be available to anybody looking for it. So the precautions, should we mitigate by sharing and publishing methodology code as well as the numbers? It's something in research that they're trying to do more and more of. People seem reluctant. It can feel scary sharing your code, like somebody's going to come in and go, oh, this is terrible. I felt like that. I do that a lot. I mean, I publish my code and it gets easier. It gets to the point where you feel like, yeah, if I've got this wrong, I can learn from this. But it's like ethics, it's like philosophy. It's about communicating and practicing. Difficult to understand. There's 11 hazards to go through, and not all of them are pertinent, but actually this one, the freedom of information brought up a lot. So the issues for this was the question itself difficult to understand. Was the error because of the misinterpretation, or was it the code was difficult to understand? The code was wrong, so there was difficulty introduced because the number was different last year to this year. And the precautions, again, back to sharing your code, methodology, caveats, updating if we have that capacity, or maybe we should have that on websites to say this is changed. May cause direct harm. I couldn't quite find this for freedom of information. I mean, I feel like it could, but I couldn't think of a scenario. So if anybody can, please jump in and we can add to this. I'm looking for help here because these were all my thoughts and I never trust just me being involved. Risk to privacy, again, I was a bit like, I don't think that's going to be an issue. Could be wrong. Not in this scenario anyway. Information governance is usually scrutinized for identifiable data, but this could cause harm. Perhaps if somebody's waiting for that waiting list, they find out it's 3 years, that might have an impact negatively to that individual. I don't know. Automates decision making. I didn't think it could, because this was clearly done ad hoc, one-off. Code was run, found it was wrong, changed it. So that doesn't feel like there was an automation there. So it didn't necessarily lead to a decision, and it wasn't something that necessarily led to something that's, say, structural in services, because it wouldn't have been FOI otherwise. I'm not sure if anyone else has a view. Lacks informed consent. Data requests like this are often about the services, not about patients, because that would be identifiable, and it's also a different kind of route legally that they should go through. So it's not service, it is a service audit rather than research. Might be used for research, but I didn't really feel like informed consent was an issue, but it may be that generally we don't give people the views to do that to themselves. I'm coming up to time, which is brilliant. I've talked for an hour, which, you know, is not unusual for me. I can talk whole days, but I wanted to see if there are any other questions or points of view from this, and then just tell you about some more ethics resources out there.
There was just one point that somebody made in relation to the under 16 smoking, which was, I think it was made in relation to that, because I think that's when it was posted, just that it would be a really good PHM question, so population health management question. It'd be ideal for that.
Yes,
so no, go ahead.
Okay, so Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I think it's quite interesting, but I think you still need that kind of explanation behind it all. I mean, often when we do our FOIs, we will send out some comments with it and some caveats, because they are so open to interpretation, and sometimes we're not entirely sure that we're going to be doing the same thing, exactly the same thing that another trust is doing, and providing exactly the same thing that another trust is doing, because often the people coming to us with the FOIs don't know how to ask the right question.
Yes.
Because they don't know the right language to ask the question. They don't talk the talk.
Yes, absolutely.
And so there's often a big interpretive thing that goes on with them. So we do have a check-in process, and we look at how it's been interpreted, and we do provide those caveats.
And that sounds like an amazing start to the precautions. So you've done that already. So you, as part of your process, you've already listed out things which sounds really good, like giving out further commentary, sort of like maybe explaining how you've interpreted the question. That's another great one. So I think that's great for the data hazard is not saying this is a hazard, don't do it. As I said before, it's about saying, well, these are the precautions and learning from each other. So that's great, I think. Thank you for that. Were there any other points that people had? You know, you might not have ever dealt with freedom of information. Is it just not an issue? Don't need to think about it. Always interested in that. I don't do much these days in freedom of information, only occasionally touch upon it, which then I feel like I'm a bit out of sorts, because I'm intrigued what people have got to say. Tom?
Just some kind of reflections on previous FOIs that I dealt with in the past roles, but we had some that used to come through, and they were obviously from pharmaceutical companies trying to work out how many people had had their competitors' drugs in a period, and it was always a case of like you wish you could find a way to wiggle out of it. Sometimes we could if it was some of the questions weren't possible to answer with the data that we had. So you go back, and others were providing available extracts elsewhere, so you could go read that. But there was somewhere you were just thinking, these aren't being asked in good faith necessarily, are they? It's an abuse of the FOI system to help their corporate gains. And there was other ones as well where we had sad cases where it was obvious someone had a bad experience and they were going through a complaints procedure and were trying to get answers out, and those would often be questions that you couldn't answer. There was that asking how many people had I'm making up a scenario, but how many people had this same kind of issue that my family member had, and some of those you definitely can't answer from ethical points of view anyway.
Yes, so that's interesting. So even though we might have a generic freedom of information, how we deal with this, but you'll get scenarios which are exceptions to that, which need consideration too. Yeah. So just quickly, because we're going to hit the hour. More resources. I feel like, and this is quite a bold statement, I don't think the NHS generally, particularly in data science and data and analytics, and maybe this extends to colleagues in other organisations too, think about ethics and how it fits into the work, or even how relevant it is. But we're on our own, to be fair. I got this information from the Bristol University, who also have a data ethics club, which anybody is welcome to come along to. So these will be shared. These presentation slides are available on our GitHub, but there's also the links there I will share on that for the Data Ethics Club. I'd recommend going along. It's virtual. It's an hour over lunchtime on a Wednesday every other week, and they do things like hacking this. It's data science, so this is about cis-tem terminology and transgender bills and things. So there's a lot of interesting things, and you can also make proposals. Civil service have awareness courses, which are online, and you can join whether you're local authority or NHS. That's fine. You have to just go through the systems, but they never say no to me, and I'm NHS. UK Statistics Authority have an ethics self-assessment tool. I kind of hit all of the top bits there because I'm always working with patient level data, but it's a really good tool, very easy to use, but I'm just always at like red. Government Data Slack, Science Slack group is also really good. They have an ethics channel where they also share reading groups and data ethics discussions. And you can just access that Slack group with any nhs.net account. And it might be a GSX if you're a local authority person, because they don't do individual organizations because there's a lot of us. So I will leave that because there's a couple of other scenarios in there, but I've run out of time. But the slides will be available to use. There's a Word document to go through if you wanted to go through the issues and precautions for each of the hazards. And these are not, this is just me trying to share. I found this, I think it's really good. I'm not using it in every single thing I do, but it's helping me give that structure to my thinking. And I really enjoyed going through the freedom of information, and I've really enjoyed talking at you and sharing it with you. But if you have any views on things, please do let me know afterwards. I'm really happy and open to debate. Outside of meetings is fine. And thank you for this opportunity. And I hope other people feel that they can come along and share fun stuff that they found too, if they found it fun.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Now, I found that really, really interesting. We'll share the slides afterwards because I think those resources that you've just ended on are really interesting for people. If they go to the ethics club as well, I think they'll find some more information. I can see lots of parallels with other areas of work, and it's quite a nice way to frame and think about, and to get people to think more and differently about how the data that they're using and the outputs they're producing. So here's me going on. I never do this. It's terrible. So thanks again. Thanks everybody for coming. I haven't gone through sort of the training and development ops that are out there at the moment. So check out the website. Get registered for Insight 2022. There's loads of good stuff happening there. It starts on the 3rd of October, but get yourself registered now. Full program is out next week. Great to see you all, and I'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.